Uh,
Request the recording to start. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, great. Good evening, all of you. Welcome back. Yet another para session of another important theme. So most of you know today's session is on how to be investor ready from a legal perspective. Today we have a practitioner who's catering to the startup space and ecosystem extensively, who will be speaking to us on this topic. Her name is Garima Mitra. She's a co-founder of Tree Life Consulting. Garima is a lawyer by profession and leads the legal and compliance segment at Tree Life Consulting. She has a deep understanding of legal aspects for startups, specializes in fundraising, contract, privacy laws, and IPR. Welcome, Garima. We are very happy to have you on board. I also welcome our participants once again. It actually is overwhelming. We are very happy at Sign to see the increasing number of registrations for every para sessions. And it's encouraging us more and more to do better and better sessions. So at Sign, we are committed to offer to the startup ecosystem with insightful and relevant session organized by experts and practitioners. So for those of you who are new to Sign, just a brief, Sign is Society of Innovation and Entrepreneurship under the aegis of IIT Bombay, Powai. We are one of the oldest technology business incubator in the country. We've been in existence for over 15 years now, and we focus on deep technology solutions. So Sign facilitates innovators, startup entrepreneurs from ideation to scale-up stage by offering incubation support, funding support, and other intangible support. The Power Hour series of Sign, incidentally, is one such support extended to our startup community. Sign, to its credit, has supported more than 160 startups, over 500 startup entrepreneurs, who in turn have generated about 4,000 plus employment. So that's about Sign. Before I hand over the discussion to Garima, the format of the session for the benefit of the audience would be as follows. Garima has gone through the questions which we have received from the participants over last few days. So based on the questions and her own insights and experience, she's going to walk us through the structure of the theme today. Post which we will also attempt to have a Q&A session where the participants can either ask or write the queries. So if you notice on the right of your screen, you will have a Q&A panel. So while the session is on, if any of you have any queries, you can always drop in your question. Either Rakesh, my colleague, or me, one of us will take it up at an appropriate time with Garima. So welcome once again, all of you, and thank you. Over to you, Garima. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ganga. It's an absolute honor to be holding this session for Sign. So, without any further ado, I will quickly introduce myself, and then we will go ahead with the session. So, I am Garima Mitra, and I am the co-founder of Tree Life Consulting. At Tree Life Consulting, what we do is provide legal, finance, and compliance help to all startups. This includes right from incorporation to helping them with their idea stage to nuanced services like fundraising, then contract management, IPR related queries and registrations, etc. So it's a complete holistic perspective that we provide, right from not just from a legal perspective or finance, but like a blend of both the worlds. So the session today is going to be about how to be investor ready and giving a legal perspective towards it. What we will see throughout the session is the basics of investment, what kind of things happen in investment, due diligence, then what are the various important terms in terms of term sheet, shareholders agreements and things like that, and to understand cap tables and ESOP. So I'm going to quickly run through these concepts. If you have any questions, like Ganga said, please put them in the Q&A panel and I will address them at the end of the session. So the first thing to understand is how an investment cycle actually works. Now, the investment cycle generally starts with pitching to investors. Now, when I say that pitching to investors is where the founders go to the investors and are telling them their ideas, giving them their projections, and coming to a point where the investors like that idea. Now, there are a lot of questions around when should we look for investment. Now, uh, each type of business has a different answer for it, but the underlying principle is the same. The underlying principle being that you only go to investors or pitch to investors when you have something which is beyond a proof of concept. So there are times where probably you are looking to build a customer platform. So at that time, the platform needs to show usage, needs to show validated usage from customers who are using this, liking it, and things like that. If probably it were some kind of a patent heavy company or operation, then you would have to show that yes, the idea is patentable. So probably go for registering a provisional patent or something of that sort. So uh, when to pitch to investors is a question, and which question for a lot of people, the answer to it is very simple. You need to show that your idea has skin and bones to it. Only then you go and pitch to investors. You cannot just have an idea and go to an investor and say, now, fund me. That is not how it works. You need to show proof of concept. You need to show usage. That is when you come to to a point where you actually pitch to investors. Now, uh, assuming that you've pitched to the investors are happy with your proposal, they like your they like your entire concept, they like your idea, and they've decided to fund you. Then the next stage is your term sheet. Now, what exactly is a term sheet? A term sheet is nothing but a letter of intent from the investors, which lays down certain important aspects of an investment, like, for example, the valuation or how much money the investor is going to invest, what are the kinds of instruments that the investor is going to take, what are the specific rights that the investor wants. All of this basically goes in a term sheet at a very, very broad level. This is, for all intents and purposes, just a letter of intent from an investor to the founders or to the company which is going to get funded. Now, once this term sheet is signed by both the parties, then you come to then the entire Pandora's box opens up. Now, when I say a Pandora's box opens up, is because you have three parallel processes that are running together, which as founders, everyone needs to understand and keep a track of. The first is due diligence. The second is the regulatory compliance that comes right before the investment actually hits the company's account. And the third is the investment agreements that you need to do, basically negotiate or probably revise and discuss with the investors. The investment agreements are nothing but your shareholders agreement and your share subscription agreement. I'm sure that you guys have heard about all of these terms very, very vaguely, or probably you all have used these, you all have undergone investment cycles and are well aware of this. What we're going to cover is this entire process in the next probably 40 to 50 minutes. And from there, understand what are the smaller or detailed nuances that founders need to keep in mind in terms of this investment cycle. So first, covering due diligence. Now, due diligences are very, very massive, or they can be very preliminary as well. Either ways, the information that is required by the investor is of the utmost importance. Now, due diligence is generally catered to in three aspects. First is a legal due diligence, second is a financial due diligence, and third is a compliance due diligence. Now, There may be times where legal and compliance is mixed, and one vendor is doing due diligence and financial due diligence is done by someone else, or all three of these can be plugged together. So it depends on how the investor wants to do this due diligence and what kind of information they ask. So typically, the underlying principle being exactly the same, that your documentation of the company will be divided into these three aspects. Now, these three aspects, what all do investors generally require? What do they ask for? And basically, what all you need to have in order to quickly undergo the due diligence process is what I'm going to discuss. Now, this is also important to all founders or companies from a perspective that the awareness of this helps you to be investor ready. Now, what is being investor ready is nothing but to understand what are going to be the requirements to anticipate the needs of your investor in order to have those gaps or have those voids plugged in right before or just before the investor enters. So that basically enables you to have a shorter time in terms of due diligence, shorter time in terms of closing the investment agreements, and to do all the closure compliances. Now, coming first to the legal due diligence. Now, in a legal due diligence, what generally they see is whether the founders have a co-founders agreement. If you are in a service business, whether you have service agreements, whether NDAs are signed where applicable, whether employment agreements are signed with your employees. Then second, what they look at is a privacy policy and terms and conditions. Now, as a company who has a mobile application or a website, all of these, both of these platforms basically require the company to mandatorily have a privacy policy in order to tell their users how they are collecting data, what sort of data is being collected, and how they use this data. This is mandated by law. So it is a requirement for everyone to have a privacy policy who has a website or a terms and conditions or a mobile application. And similarly, a terms and conditions document is something that governs your relationship as a company with the users of this mobile application or website. So that is in turn to safeguard the company. Now, these are the two important things that investors look at in order to understand whether the company has been taking right steps in following due process, which is designed by the law, and whether it is also taking steps to legally safeguard itself. Then they want to look at whether there are any notices that the company has received, if there's any pending litigation. Obviously, when the company is very new, 3-4 years into existence, there are not many disputes or not many litigation that happens. However, if there are any legal notices that the company has received, then that is also to be revealed in a legal due diligence. Then comes the legal structuring of the company. This is slightly important in terms of understanding for the investment that how you have structured your company. Now, there are also a lot of times where we see that there was an LLP first. Founders probably had an LLP first, and then they converted into a private limited company. Or there are times where there is an LLP existing doing the same business of the same founders, and because they wanted to get an investment, they've incorporated a private limited company. So all of these issues also arise in a legal due diligence. It's very, very important, which is why to understand and to have a very, very logical justification on why the legal structuring of a company is the way it is. So probably if you have an LLP now and if you're looking for funding, then you have to start taking steps to convert into a private limited company and so on and so forth. Then what investors look at from a legal due diligence point of view is IPR, intellectual property rights. Now, intellectual property rights are very, very important in today's time because the kind of businesses that are coming up, the kind of startups that are cropping up have immense IPR. So they have a lot of intellectual property that is being created, like say, for example, mobile applications, then various SaaS which come up in terms of basically generating reports. Then there are a lot of patentable things that are coming up in terms of startups. So all of this, how the founders or how the company is trying to safeguard their intellectual property rights is what the investor is going to look at from a legal perspective. Because a company's worth, a startup's worth, is generated out of the intellectual property that the company has prepared or is going to work towards generating and nurturing. So, an intellectual property, any intellectual property is very, very important in terms of understanding what the worth of the company is going to be. Because when there are early stage investors coming in, the early stage investors don't want to, they don't really they're not investing in the company, they're investing in the founders and they're investing in the intellectual property that the founders have created. Then comes licenses. Now, there are certain peculiar companies or startups who are in certain businesses which may require very, very streamlined licenses. Like, say, for example, if a startup were in the lending space, they may require an NBFC license. So, whether those licenses have been procured correctly and the company is following the law to in order to conduct its operations is something that the investors want to see from a legal perspective. So this is on a holistic basis in terms of legal due diligence. Then coming to financial due diligence. Now, in a financial due diligence, um, what an investor asks for or what the due diligence is made up of are very, very basic documents from the company. However, we've also noticed in our experience that a lot of companies do not have this data correctly aligned because probably they've not had an accounting, they've not had any accounting help that to streamline their financials, or probably the accounting help has not been adequate, or probably it was just these are times where financial prudence was not given that much importance. So before you go for an investment, before you go to an investor, it is very, very important that your financial statements or your accounts are in order so as to project a correct picture to the investor about how you are working with your money, or how it is going to flow, from where the revenue is coming, where expenses are going. All of that has to be correctly recorded and projected in order to give an investor the confidence. Because in the end, it all boils down to numbers. So a financial due diligence is generally very, very rigorous in terms of understanding how the startup is functioning. And it is also one of the easiest places where the investor can look at and can ask you questions. So it's very important to have your financial statements in place. So what exactly investors require in terms of financial due diligence is first the books of accounts, that is your general revenue and expenses that are maintained in either QuickBooks, Zoho Books, or Tally. Then comes audited financial statements. As people here probably who already have private limited companies and have been operating their companies for quite some time understand that every year it is important for a private limited company to get their financial statements audited. You need to get your statutory audit done, which is where these financial statements are required, where the auditor, a third-party auditor is appointed and financial statements are audited. Then the second thing that they require is also bank statements. So your audited financial statements and book of accounts can probably be manipulated, which is why investors also insist that bank statements be provided, because bank statements are also an important portrayal of what kind of expenses and revenue the company is getting. Then there are certain financial regulatory returns that are required in terms of TDS, GST, and all of that. Then comes compliance of foreign payments. Now, there are times where a lot of companies use platforms which are not located in India and make a lot of foreign payments. They may probably hire some freelancer from a website and make a payment which is foreign. So at that time, it is very, very important to understand what the compliance of of these foreign payments are, and to have that in place. So it's important to sometimes seek professional help if probably you're doing something like that and large sum of money is being transferred outside India in terms of this. Then the accounting policies, they want to see what kind of accounting policies are followed by the company in order to maintain their books. And lastly, what they require is your projections and valuations. Now, these projections are, of course, based on your cash flows and on the kind of estimation that you have for the next 3 years or the next 5 years in order. And these are also evaluated with a way to build a business plan in place. Now, these projections or the business plan that you generally derive in terms of getting an investment acts as a yardstick for the investor to see how the funds of the investment are going to be used by the company. Of course, you all will understand and appreciate that when a investor is giving money, it is not just just a free fund money, right? You have to take that money, you have to account for it, and you have to show that the money has been used for increasing the company's business or for a company's expansion, right? So, which is how financial due diligence is very, very important. Coming to compliance due diligence, this is also one of the places where a lot of companies take a lot of time, lose a lot of money in terms of paying penalty, because compliance was not given a priority in companies when they just started out. So founders sometimes feel that compliance is not very important, but take it from me that non-compliance is even more costly than what compliance would cost you. Sometimes it just ends up being penny wise, pound foolish. So whether your ROC filings are in place, whether all your board minutes and shareholder minutes are in place, what other compliances like, for example, related to labor law, related to shops and establishment, all of this is also very, very important, because otherwise you end up paying a hefty penalty on this. And of course, when a due diligence happens, this will come out that you don't, as a company, you don't have that. And these all basically act as anomalies in the due diligence that the investor sees in your company. Then there are statutory registers that need to be maintained. Share certificates are a very important point where we've also seen that a lot of companies don't have share certificates, and if there have been share transfers, then the transfer forms are not recorded correctly. And the stamp duty that is to be paid on such compliance. Now that we understand that these are the general documents that are verified, we are quickly going to understand what are the common observations that come in the DD. Now you have to understand that any observations that come in these in the due diligence process. So when I say observations, these are the various gaps that that the investor notifies you that these are the gaps in your legal or finance or compliance, and these gaps in turn become either conditions precedent or condition subsequent based on what the veracity or based on the intensity of the non-compliance in all three gamuts. Now, conditions precedent is generally the conditions that need to be followed or need to be completed before the investor actually puts in money. And condition subsequent is generally some action that needs to be done by the company after the investor puts in the money. So generally, everything that is very, very high priority, like say, for example, stamp duty to be paid or agreements to be issued or made and things like that are become a condition precedent, whereas smaller minute things become condition subsequent. So the common observations that we've seen in a due diligence process are that in from a legal due diligence point of view, firstly, that there are certain inconsistent terms in your agreements. So certain agreements might say A plus B is equal to C, but at the same time may also say that A plus B is equal to D. This would lead to inconsistent terms in the agreements. There are times when companies may not actually have agreements at all. So that would just be an inadequacy of agreements. Then there are times where stamp duty had to be paid on agreements and that stamp duty has not been paid. So understand that stamp duty is also very, very important to be paid at certain times by a company because it generally makes the agreement or the contract enforceable in the court of law. If certain stamp duty had to be paid and it is not paid and the matter goes into litigation, at that time the court can actually order the company or can order the payment of stamp duty along with penalty. So the penalty is also 4 times the non-payment of stamp duty, the amount that is of the stamp duty which is not paid. Then there are times where a lot of us as founders have promised equity to advisors or to angel investors, and we've promised the equity, but there is no documentation to prove that. So there are also these are anomalies where sometimes what happens is the investor wants to see how the entire cap table of your company looks like. So at that time, if he's not seen an angel investor or he's not seen an advisor on the investment cap table, then they feel that they're not a part of it. However, there are times when in a due diligence, people tend to explain that no, oh, I had promised probably 5% of equity to an advisor, but we have not yet allotted, or we don't have any documentation to prove that. So that is also one of very, very common observation that comes in. Then there are reproduced agreements. A lot of people, a lot of founders, sometimes to save money, feel that just reproducing one agreement to another is also okay. However, there are times when these agreements may not be applicable for your business. They may be more harmful than actually beneficial. So it's always important to understand that reproduced agreements may not be the answer to everything, even if it's the smallest of an agreement like an NDA. Then lastly, like I said, that there's a lot of importance on intellectual property rights. Then inadequate IPR protection also becomes a very common observation. So say, for example, there is you're undertaking a business which has a great brand presence. Now everyone is using that brand and you have usage, but if that word or the brand that you're using, say you're using the brand ABC, if that is not trademarked, then someone else can actually infringe upon it. So that is one thing to see, that whether you have protected your intellectual property rights. Another thing is probably you're working on something patentable. Now, if that were patentable and you have not taken a provisional patent for it before going to market, that is also a matter of concern from a legal standpoint, because it shows goes to show the inadequacy of intellectual property protection that you can have. So these are some of the issues that come up in legal due diligence. Then coming to financial due diligence. Financial due diligence basically has irregularities in filing returns. If books of accounts are not updated on a regular basis, then a lot of transactions are treated very ad hoc in terms of giving them accounting treatments. Then certain statutory payments are not made, like TDS, GST. This is not paid at time. And basically there are arrears to the government. Then again, no compliance of foreign payments, then TDS non-compliance. So the list goes on, but these are the common observations that come up in a DD very, very quickly. In terms of compliance, then the most common is the failure to maintain a minutes register or a statutory register. So a lot of founders or a lot of companies do not provide, do not give that much importance to maintaining minutes, and which is why uh, this is something that comes up. But of course, this is all very, very solvable. It's not that, it's the end of the work, end of the world. So you just have to make sure that if you maintained it right since the beginning, then it's not a big pile of work that comes up right before the due diligence or after the due diligence. Then share certificates are often missing. Sometimes after the incorporation, founders are not have not kept tabs, so then share certificates are not issued by the company. And some statutory forms are not filed. And government registrations like shops and establishment registration that is required is not done. PT registration is not done. And also now we see that that the Ministry of Corporate Affairs is coming up with a lot of different filings. So it's very dynamic, which is why you have to keep a tab on this. So sometimes it so happens that the founders have probably not, because they are so busy with their business, so busy with the product development and everything, that there is a gap in knowledge where there were certain requirements and they were not done. So that is also something that comes up in compliance. Now, once that we know that what are the observations that come up in the DD and the DD process is finalized, like I said, whatever anomalies, whatever gaps that are noticed, they go as conditions precedent and conditions subsequent. Now we'll come to what are the common terms in an investment deal. So this is basically a slide which generally talks about the jargon that any investment deal will have. SHA, SSA, what are the terms of the investment? What are the types of instruments? Then what is the concept of pre-money and post-money valuation? How does the dilution of shareholding actually take place? And whether an ESOP pool is important or not. So in the next, I think 20 to 25 minutes, we'll be covering these aspects, which basically will take you through the jargon of any investment cycle and will also enable you to understand what these terms mean, what are the nuances, so as to empower you to take certain decisions at the time of investment, at the time when you meet an investor or an investment is happening. So first, starting with investment agreements. Now, investment agreements are nothing but, like I said, a term sheet. Now, term sheet is a letter of intent that is given by the investor and has very, very broad level terms of the investment. So, like valuation, what is the amount, etc. And this is usually non-binding in nature. So, it is non-binding on either of the parties, because after the term sheet, if probably something goes wrong, then the investment will not go through. So just signing a term sheet is not enough, because it is not binding on either of the parties. Then coming to share subscription agreement. A share subscription agreement is the terms that are terms on which the incoming investor will subscribe to the shares of the company. Now, what is the type of instrument that the investor is going to basically take? What is the price? When will be the subscription money coming in? And is signed by the future shareholders of the company. Now, subscription agreement just tells you that the investor is subscribing to the shares of the company. It does not have anything else apart from that. The rights that the investor is going to take, these rights come in the shareholders agreement. The shareholders agreement basically details out all the liabilities, all the rights, all your obligations in terms of providing the investor an exit, providing him with the right to transfer his shares, the lock-in of shares for promoters, etc. And the shareholders agreement finally works as a charter document of your company. Now, when I say charter document of your company, people who have a private limited company here are very well versed that They've signed a memorandum of association and articles of association. Now, the MOA, AOA are your charter documents. Now, the shareholders agreement, once it is signed, is basically replaces your articles of association or the AOA. So, in order to understand the gravity of an SHA, you have to understand that the AOA is changed to reflect the shareholders agreement. So, anything and everything that you accept in a shareholders agreement is essentially becomes binding, not just contractually, but also statutorily. Now, most of the times in early stage investments, the share subscription agreement and shareholders agreement are clubbed and are now popularly known as the SSHA. So that is a share subscription and shareholders agreement. Then lastly, there is a share purchase agreement. This is very peculiar to places where there is a secondary sale of shares happening. Otherwise, this is not a part of typical investment agreements where an investor is coming in and subscribing to new shares of the company. Now, coming to what are the important terms in a term sheet. Now, we've taken the liberty to basically have around 5 terms which are which we've seen generally create a lot of confusion amongst founders, and the understanding of it is very, very important because the repercussions of these terms are also wide. Now, coming to the first one, ROFO and ROFR. I'm sure that all of you all have heard ROFO, ROFR, n number of times, read about it, and things like that. Now, just to give you a very, very brief understanding, the only difference between ROFO and ROFR is the price determination. When the price of the shares that you're going to sell will be determines what that right is, whether it is the right of first offer, that is ROFO, or whether it is the right of first refusal, that is ROFO. Now, ROFO is when the offeree's right to purchase the shares is derived through internal negotiations. So, say for example, if a founder wanted to sell his shares or an investor wanted to sell his shares, then it would be first decided amongst the founders and the investors that the price of the share is probably going to be 100 rupees, for example. Now, this price determination is done internally. Whereas in a ROFR, the price determination is done basically from the current market valuation or from a third party offer that the party who wants to sell its shares has received. So here the example would be that the investor or the founder has received an offer of 100 rupees from a third party or has probably derived a price of 100 rupees through the current market valuation and is now going to sell its shares. So effectively what happens is that a ROFO and a ROFR determine that before selling the shares to any third party, you have to first offer it to the people who are within your company. Now, ideally, all your investors take a ROFR, that is where the price is determined by the current market valuation on founder's shares. So, for example, if a founder had to go and sell his shares, then he would first have to have a current market valuation and then he would have to show it to the investors. And the investors, if they are going to match that price, then they're going to then the founder has to compulsorily sell it to the investor. Now coming to liquidation preference. Liquidation preference is nothing but it defines a seniority level on how you can how an investor is going to claim their return from the company in times of a liquidation event. A liquidation event is nothing but probably an acquisition or a sale of the company's assets and things like that. Now, liquidation preference is where the investor says that before all of the founders get any kind of gain from the liquidation event or the proceeds of the sale or the proceeds of the acquisition, the first preference is given to the investor. Now, there are also types of liquidation preference, but the underlying principle is that whoever has the liquidation preference has the seniority to the payout order. Then third comes the anti-dilution. Now, anti-dilution again is a very, very widely discussed topic amongst founders, that what is anti-dilution, what kind of anti-dilution should be used. Now, the underlying principle or the basic concept of anti-dilution is nothing but it protects the investor's shareholding percentage in the event that the company is going to issue any shares which are at a price that is lower than what he has subscribed to. Say, for example, an investor is holding 10% at 10% and has bought the shares at a valuation of 5 crores. Now, 6 months down the line, if the company wants to issue shares at a valuation of 3 crores, then this becomes a down round. And this is the time when anti-dilution will kick in for an investor, because at that time, the value of his shares is going to go down. Now, coming to tag along. Tag along and drag along are generally used in terms of who has the right to pull whom. As the name suggests, tag along means the right of any minority shareholder to actually tag along with the majority shareholder when he's selling his shares. So generally, investors take a tag along right on founder shares and things like that. Then there is drag along. Drag along again means that someone can drag you to sell your shares. So it is basically a right that the investor takes, which can force the founders to sell their shares along with the investors if they wish to. Now, this is generally this drag along right is generally exercised only in an event of default. Now, this event of default is generally when the company is unable to provide an exit, or there is certain misrepresentations done by the company and things like that. So the drag along right is something that is used by the investor as the last protective measure against the company. Then come conversion, word seat, exit options, reserve matters, and ESOP pool. Now, conversion is on the terms, there are certain convertible securities that are provided by the company. That time conversion comes into picture. Then there is a board seat that may be provided to the investor. Now, this can either be a director or an observer. Then there are exit options. Now, exit options, which are also provided in term sheet on a very, very broad level. These can include an IPO, a third-party sale, a strategic sale, or a buyback by the company of the investor shares. Now, there are also reserve matters. Reserve matters are very, very important because they basically define the various subject matters on which the company cannot proceed or take decision without the investor's prior approval. So it is very important to understand the functioning of your company and then to look at the reserve matters and see whether the investors can have a right in those subject matters. Then there is an ESOP pool. The generally term sheets have a placeholder where ESOP pool is carved out, and investors insist that an ESOP pool be carved out before they enter the company. Now, coming to the various types of instruments that are there. So there are typically 4 types of instruments that are used in investments throughout India. Now, first is equity shares. These are the common stock of the company, and They are basically the founders are the ones who hold these equity shares. Now they have all the voting rights in the company. So the terms of those are generally a pre-money valuation and the share price. There is no conversion as such that happens in equity shares. Then second is your compulsorily convertible preference shares. Now, these are nothing but CCPS. Now, CCPS are basically have very, very limited voting rights. Without an equity share, you cannot vote extensively in a private limited company. CCPS is one of the most popular types of securities that are taken in India by investors. Now, they have very limited voting rights. They have liquidation preference, like we have discussed earlier. This liquidation preference is over and above the holders of the equity shares, that is the founders. Now, the terms here generally have are the pre-money valuation on which the investor is going to come, share price, the terms of conversion, generally which is 1:1, and may include a floor or a cap as well. I will discuss the floor and cap in a bit once I also discuss about compulsorily convertible debentures and convertible notes. Now, compulsorily convertible debentures are CCDs, which are quasi-equity. So they're generally used primarily used at a time where the company is raising a bridge round and is not sure about at what valuation to take the money for. Now, this generally includes again a cap and a floor price for the conversion of the shares. And sometimes it also includes a discount that is worked up in terms of this conversion. Then coming to convertible notes. Now, convertible notes are short-term debt that usually converts into the shares of the company. This is a very hybrid kind of security and is very, very new in terms of legalization. Now, it is a hybrid of debt and equity features. Now, however, what is important to understand here is that convertible notes can be provided only when the investment amount is 25 lakhs each investor. So if you have 10 different investors who are investing 25 lakhs together, then convertible notes cannot be issued. One person has to be providing 25 lakhs. This is something that a lot of founders overlook and is very, very important. Then the terms basically have interest on the convertible note, and generally milestones are provided for the conversion or a cap and a floor of price, and basically these are have to be converted within 5 years. Now, when we talk about cap and floor price, so I'm going to give you an example where, say, for example, if a company has issued compulsorily convertible preference shares at 5 crore rupees valuation, pre-money valuation of 5 crores. Now, however, the founders and the investors feel that the valuation is not static and is eligible to change. At that time, certain floor and cap can be issued. Now, this would mean that the investor is coming in at a pre-money valuation of 5 crores. However, it may have a milestone that if the founder is going to raise another round at 7 crores, then the 7 crores, then the pre-money valuation will increase to 7 crores and the investors' securities will convert at 7 crore rupees. So here, however, here the cap becomes 7 crore rupees, and at times, if the founder is unable to raise any equity round or any further funding round, at that time the conversion will happen at 5 crore rupees and not less. That is your floor. Now, there may be a time where you may say that the founder within 6 months has managed to raise a funding round at a pre-money valuation of 10 crores. But even at that time, here, because our cap is 7 crore rupees, the CCPS or the CCDs or the convertible notes will convert at 7 crores itself because we've kept it as a cap. So this is just a mere representation of a floor and cap to make you understand the concept. Then we also get a lot of questions on how much to dilute and how to dilute and things like that. So this is, I'm just going to keep this table here in order to, understand that these are basically the various rounds that are there in the investment, like a friends and family, seed and angel round, a series A and a series B. These are typical dilution points and the quantum that are generally seen in the industry in terms of coming up in at the time of such rounds. So friends and family is your first round, very, very important. Then comes seed round, then of course series A, series B, so on and so forth. So the typical dilution is, again, the first round is 15 to 20%. Then seed and angel round have 20%, series A has 20 to 30%, and of course the quantum, as I've already I'm projecting here. And I'm sure that all of you are well versed with the generic norms. So again, these are not very, very static formulae, or this is not the ground rule for dilution. However, this is what the industry has seen. These are the various industry standards and average that you may call. Now coming to what is pre-money and what is post-money valuation. Now on very, very, very simple terms, post-money valuation is equal to pre-money valuation plus investment amount. So whenever you hear someone talking about, oh, I raised 25 lakhs on a pre-money valuation of 1 crore rupees. So it means that pre-money valuation is the value of the company that is mutually agreed upon by the investors and the founders. That is before receiving the investment. And the post-money valuation will be when the investment amount is added to the pre-money valuation. So here, the post-money valuation will be 1.25 crores because the pre-money valuation was 1 crore, which was derived by the investors and the founders mutually. The investment amount was 25 lakhs, and the post-money valuation therefore becomes 1.25 crores. Now we'll quickly go to understand what are how a cap table is generated. Now, a cap table is nothing but a complete series of cross multiplication. So there is no greater science to forming cap tables or anything of that sort. It is just simple cross multiplication, which I will explain to you through actual actual case study. So here the facts are that the initial shareholding pattern of a company called Good Health Private Limited, which has three co-founders. So it has Krunal, Rohan, and Preeti. Now, Krunal, Rohan, and Preeti have decided to split their shares into 40%, 30%, and 30% each. Now, typically, when a company is incorporated, the number of shares are 10,000 and the paid up capital is generally 1 lakh rupees. So we've gone on that presumption and taken that Krunal with 40% has 4,000 shares, Rohan with 30% has 3,000 shares, and Preeti with 30% shares has 3,000 shares again. And the total is 10,000 shares. This is the first scenario where the company is just formed. Now coming to the second scenario is where Rohan, who is one of the co-founders, wants to exit from the daily business. So what he does is he transfers his shares to his other co-founders. But what he says is that I still want to retain 1% of the company. So what happens is that 1% of the company is of course calculated at 100 shares. So keeping Rohan with 100 shares out of his 3000, there is 2900 shares which have to be transferred. Now, how are these transferred? These shares are transferred in the ratio of Krunal is to Preeti. So Krunal, Rohan and Preeti were at a ratio of 4:3:3. Correct? So now what is going to be the ratio between Krunal and Preeti is what is going to define how their shares are transferred. So the transfer to Krunal is for 1657 shares and to Preeti it is 1243 shares. This is again in the multiplication of the shareholding that is there present. Which again brings us to there is no change in the number of shares. There is no change in the actual number, the final number of shares which are held by all three of them. So it is still 10,000 because it is a transfer of shares. It is not issue of shares. Now coming to the second example, where the company wants to create an ESOP pool of 15% of the shareholding. Now, this is probably a condition precedent to the investment. At this point, what happens is that Krunal, Rohan, and Preeti together are holding 10,000 shares, and the ESOP pool to be carved out is 15%. So, the baseline concept for this is that if Krunal, Rohan, and Preeti are holding 10,000 shares, that equals to 85% of the shareholding. Why 85% you would ask is because the ESOP has to be pegged at 15%. So, which is how you calculate that 10,000 shares are equal to 85%. So, 15% of ESOP will equal to how many shares? So it is just a mere cross multiplication of 15% into 10,000 upon 85%, which gives you a total of around 1764 point something, which has been rounded off to 1765. Now, this 1765 are the additional amount of shares that are provided in the cap table. So 11765 is the total number of shares now. You have to understand that the percentage wise, this is going to change. Now, how the percentage is going to change is again based on the ratio of their shareholding. Now, the ratio of their shareholding on amongst the three of them was 56.57 is to 1 is to 42.43. Now, this is basically divided by 15 and it is carved out from each of their percentages and provided to ESOP. The end number for the total number of shares, the percentage always has to be 100. Now, coming to when the investor comes in. Now, again, using the same example, that an investor puts in an investment of 25 lakhs at a pre-money valuation of 1 crore rupees. Now, this 1 crore rupees is basically a pre-money valuation for Krunal, Rohan, Preeti, and the ESOP shares. So, which means that 11,765 shares that were there in the previous slides are equal to 1 crore rupees. Now, how are you going to calculate how many shares to give to the investor? The investor has already said that I'm going to give 25 lakhs. Again, cross multiplication comes into the picture here, where 11,765 shares, which is Krunal plus Rohan plus Preeti plus ESOP, is equal to 1 crore. So, basically, you have to figure out how much is it going to be for 25 lakhs? So according to that, you can either have a pre-money, post-money calculation where you can figure out that 25 lakhs is equal to 2941 shares. Now, when that 2941 shares comes in, the total of Krunal, Rohan, Preeti, ESOP and the investor becomes 14,706 shares. The percentage is then calculated based on these numbers. So this is basically how a cap table is formed. These are the various types of scenarios that come in, and with that, I think the understanding of a cap table, the underlying principle remains the same, and you just have to apply the principle of cross multiplication time and again to come to the amount, to come to the number of shares, to come to the percentage that is required. Now, do you need an ESOP pool? Yes, ideally investors do require an ESOP pool. ESOP stands for Employee Stock Option Plan, and ESOPs are generally issued by the companies to provide a stake to their employees in the company, to give them ownership in the company. ESOPs are not exactly shares, they are options given, or the right given to an employee to buy the shares of the company at a price that is substantially lower than the market value. The company generally goes on to adopt an ESOP policy. This ESOP policy generally has important terms like granting, vesting, and exercise. And there are various tax implications that come in terms of this ESOP. So the tax implications being on how you can, when the employee exercises his option, when the employee is given the right that you are going to get 100 share, you have the right to buy 100 shares of the company, right? Over a period of 4 years. Now, when I say over a period of 4 years, I mean that they will vest equally for the next 4 years. So, which means after completion of 1 year of working, it is going to be around 25 options. So, I have the right to buy 25 shares of the company at the end of 1 year, 50 at the end of 2 years, 75, and so on and so forth. Now, when I actually go to exercise my option, which means that I go to the company and say that this is my right to buy 25 shares, I'm going to buy these shares. That is when tax implications arise. So for employees, generally, if, for example, when they are buying the shares, at that time, the exercise price or the discounted price provided by the company is 10 rupees, and the market price of the share of the company is 100 rupees. 90 rupees is the gain that the employee has and has to pay tax on it, which is why companies generally work towards creating an ESOP policy which is more employee friendly and helps them to give them probably a longer period to exercise this right, and probably give them the right to exercise this when they have a buyer in place and things like that. So that is the basic understanding for ESOP, and I think with that we will close this discussion and open the floor for any questions that we have. We'll, I think, be taking a little bit of very generic questions that have come up, and if there is anything that is very peculiar or that can be taken up offline, I will be glad to do so. You can just write to me, and I'll be able to answer any and all your queries if we are not able to solve them because of paucity of time here. Thanks, Ganga. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Garima, for the insightful attention, complete audience, listening to it. We all got very good feedback saying it's very clear and very clearly explained. So I'll just request my colleague Rakesh to probably read out a few questions which have come around in the panel, and then we can call it a day. Rakesh, over to you.
Yeah. One question from Derek. He asks, equity for advisor and convertible debt for investor, is it a good combination? To give equity to advisor and to give convertible debt to an investor, is that a good combination? Hope I was audible. I can't hear feedback.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I think there is some problem in the connection. Yeah. So advisor equity, yes, you may give advisor equity at the beginning. Certain advisors prove very, very fruitful for the company in terms of, helping them, guiding them throughout their journey and helping them uh, probably raise further funds and things like that. So advisor equity is something that is given by people a lot. It is, I mean, again, it's something that is up to the company, but is highly advisable. You can provide probably 1.2 to 2% equity to advisors. Convertible debt, again, like I said, compulsorily convertible debt is raised from investors at a point of time when the company does not know what the valuation of the company is. When you cannot determine a valuation, that is when a compulsorily convertible debenture is offered. So I think that is the stage where a company should evaluate giving CCDs or compulsory convertible debt.
Right. Thanks, Garima, for that answer. Derek, I hope it is clear. The other question is in terms of the CCPS. Why is the CCPS more popular? How it protects the founders and investors?
Okay. So CCPS is a compulsorily convertible preference share. It is so preference shares and equity shares are different only in one nuance, where preference shareholders are given liquidation preference. They are given preference when the company is being sold or if there are proceeds coming out of a liquidation event. So that is the first and foremost reason that investors take compulsorily convertible preference shares, which is why it is also very, very popular choice. Uh, Now, again, how it protects the investors, because they get the liquidation preference. How it protects the founder is that the founders do not need to have or be very wary about issuing compulsorily convertible preference shares, is because ultimately they are an equity instrument itself. So they are going to get converted into equity shares. So, which is why they are very popular, because they are a very safe bet for the investors along with the founders as well.
Right. Thanks, Kariman. Nowadays, we also hear about OCPS and also safe notes. What is your take on that in terms of a simple agreement for future equity that is also increasingly becoming popular?
So OCPS are optionally convertible preference shares. Now again, OCPS is something which may or may not convert into equity shares. They can be redeemed. So you have to understand that at a time where the company is raising funds or a startup is raising funds, the company is generally not in a position where it can redeem shares. So when I say redeem, is that it cannot give the money back to the investors. So which is why OCPS is a dark horse, but which we have not seen as much in investment deals as CCPS, because the CCPS is a compulsorily convertible preference share. So there is no question of redemption. It's just a dividend payout that is pegged at 0.01% or something, and the shares are just converted into equity. And OCPS is where the company may have to give redemption to give redemption to the investor. So that is about OCPS. Safe notes are again nothing from what I understand and what we've seen. Safe notes are actually just a branding of a different type of compulsorily convertible preference shares. So compulsorily convertible preference shares with certain characteristics that are peculiar to an investor are generally now branded as safe notes. So that is nothing but a different branding of compulsorily convertible preference shares.
Got it. Thanks, Garima. We have a question from Vipin Lokande. He asks, having an investor on board of a startup looks more cumbersome than having a financial partner in a conventional business. Is this impression correct? So he's asking. Yeah.
I actually don't. I didn't actually understand the meaning of a financial partner. So probably if he can take it up offline, probably I can discuss it with him. So financial partner, what would that imply ideally?
Swati, can I ask you to probably unmute Bipin? If you could do that. Okay. Swati,
Okay, Rakesh, if it is not possible, can I interpret for Garima? This is Poini here.
Sure, ma'am. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's more like Garima, any family business or strategic investor who is not going, who may or may not be participating in the company. They just want to park their fund as an investor vis-a-vis our angel, startup angel investors or VC firms. So this is what he meant by financial partner. That's what I see.
Okay, so Vipin, I think it is going on Poini ma'am's interpretation. Again, I think it is a very it depends on every business on how you want to what kind of capital you want to get on board and how you want to utilize it. Of course, getting an investor on board, it looks cumbersome and looks like it is a lot of work because probably I took it over a session of 1 hour. But yes, there is no gain without pain. So there are things. Ultimately, you have to understand that whether it's a financial partner or an investor, they're all looking to make money out of your business. They are investing in your business and they are believing in the founders. So giving them accountability, providing them with certain reports, giving them certain insights, and taking their guidance is something that is going to be common whether it's a financial partner or an investor. So all the investor asks for is accountability and how the money is used, and is again looking to protect its own interest because ultimately it is their capital that is being used in your business. And a financial partner is also going to expect the same, probably not without as many rights, but ultimately they're going to want to gain something out of your business, which is why probably the processes are different, but the end result is going to be the same, is what I feel. Probably Poini ma'am can also give some insights on this if she has to add to it.
Yeah, so thank you very much. See, I think you are right. Not all financial like investor will actually overlook all this requirement because they also want at the end of the day legally compliant, regulatory compliant and financially secured companies, right? So that is one thing. Second thing is that the financial investor may not get the value that actual this startup investors like angel or VC who can help you raise further capital in future. So that at the end of the day, when you look for money, I think you want to look for smart money who can add value to your companies in business or fundraising or network, so on and so forth.
Thanks, Poini ma'am and Garima. We'll just take one last question. I can see Vikram Bansal, one of the attendees, have raised his hand. Can I ask Swati to unmute him? Swati, are you able to do that? Or I can ask Vikram to type his message.
Hello?
Yes, Swati, could you unmute?
Hello? Unmute whom?
Vikram Bansal is one of the attendees. He's raised his hand.
Okay. Hello? Yes, Vikram?
Yeah, ma'am, I actually attended a seminar by Mr. John Moen. He's a professor at the London Business School. And his opinion is that one should not raise any money and should only work with customers' money. Try to raise money by customers' money. In the sense, build your startup slowly and surely, but only with customers' money so that you validate your concept and go on and on. And there are very little instances where you need actually VC money. That is his point of view. And I found it strikingly insightful, this opinion. And this contrasts very much with whatever we're discussing right now. So I want to know your opinion about it.
So, Vikram, actually, if you go to see, a bootstrapped business is one of the best businesses. So, you have complete equity control, you have complete control over your business, and it actually says that, your business works. The validation that you get is completely out of this world. Again, I understand where the professor is coming from, saying that you should only use customers' money and bootstrap your business. However, you have to understand that with in the last 4 to 5 years, the type of startups that have been coming up and the startups are here to disrupt, right? With a bootstrap mechanism, the company can grow probably at a smaller pace than what it can with an investor influx, right? So it is again, it's a very varied question. I mean, your business may not require any funding and can do great when you're bootstrapping it. Whereas there are tech platforms or there are certain patent related startups who require a lot of funding to actually get to the next level, where even without customers, they need some capital infusion in terms to expand or to disrupt the entire industry, right? So you have to understand that startups today are looking for disruption. They're looking to expand exponentially. And sometimes that is not possible with customer money, because customer money, again, is very, very limited. So I think that is another perspective that you can take back and mull over it. Of course, I mean, bootstrapping a business is the best way to do business. I mean, that's the traditional way to do business, and it's here to stay. It's not so I think you should not look at funding exercises as a replacement to bootstrapping a business, but you see them as expansion. You see it as expansion capital.
All right.
Thanks, Vikram. Thanks, Garima. I hand over now to Ganga. Ganga, I think we have run out of time.
Yes. Thank you. I think it was very insightful session, Garima, and we all learned a lot. While we are wrapping up, we just want to inform the audience that in case you would like to reach out to Sign to understand more about what incubation we do and what we have to offer. We request you to write to us at bd@signitb.org. You're also most welcome to visit our website. And from there, you can reach out, get to understand what we offer. And please visit our office once the lockdown situation is in control. So thank you, Garima, for taking time out. It was a brilliant session. We are also Yes, we are also going to be hosting this recording on our YouTube channel. So people who've been writing to us, asking us for more details, if we're going to get the PPT, etc., you can always refer to that. So with that, we wrap up. Next Thursday or Friday, we're going to have yet another interesting session. It's on Friday. So request the audience to come back and spend another powerful hour with us. Thank you so much.